As the dust over Ontario's anti-tariff commercial begins to settle, there appears to be a shift in Premier Doug Ford's stance.
When politics and economics collide, the dust flies high. This week, the Canadian political scene was shaken up again. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, known for his bluntness and stubbornness, suddenly softened his tone. Not long ago, he was publicly challenging Washington, declaring that Canada would not back down in trade negotiations. But now he is supporting the federal government and calling for unity. What has changed? Why has one of the loudest voices in provincial politics suddenly started talking about compromise? It all started with some loud steps. Literally, the province of Ontario launched an advertising campaign against U.S. tariffs. The video, broadcast on television and online, became a symbol of resistance.
Going forward, we're going to ensure that our communications are in line. When the time comes to speak with Americans, we'll do it in partnership with the federal government.
And Ford himself looked like a leader ready to defend Canadian interests, even if Ottawa was taking a cautious stance. But shortly after U.S. President Donald Trump unexpectedly broke off trade negotiations with Canada, the political landscape changed. The federal government, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, asserted its exclusive jurisdiction over international trade agreements and effectively asked the provinces to step aside. Ford found himself in a difficult situation. On the one hand, he had the support of voters who love him for his tough stance and simple slogans. On the other hand, there was reality, international trade, where every word can cost millions of dollars and thousands of jobs. And now, instead of his usual rhetoric about Ontario's independence, Ford says, he is the Prime Minister and I am the Premier of the province. National deals are his responsibility. I am ready to support him. Words that seemed impossible just a week ago. However, one step back does not mean surrender. Ontario retains its countermeasure, a ban on the sale of American alcohol in LCBO stores. This decision, albeit symbolic, remains the only real countermeasure that works in practice.
He is the Prime Minister. I'm the Premier. When it comes to national issues, making a deal with the U.S. and anyone else, that falls on his lap. I'm there to support him, suggest ideas, along with every other Premier in the country.
Ford insists, we will not back down. This is the right decision. But even here, the question arises, won't this alcohol boycott become a new irritant in the already fragile negotiations? After all, any trifle can become a pretext for escalation. Behind this quiet turn lies a much bigger story, the struggle for political leadership within the country. Who really sets the tone in Canadian politics? The federal government, which controls international relations, or provincial leaders, who are closer to the people and respond more quickly to crises? And most importantly, how long will this fragile alliance last if negotiations with Washington go off the rails again? Today, we will examine why Ford changed his position, what is happening behind the scenes of the Canadian-American negotiations, and how one advertising campaign turned into the political turning point of the year. This is a story about power, trade, and cautious diplomacy, where every step can lead to either reconciliation or the beginning of a new conflict. The first flashes of conflict between Ontario and the federal government began long before Donald Trump interrupted trade negotiations with Canada. For several weeks, there had been whispers in Ottawa political circles that Doug Ford was preparing something big.
Anything could be an irritant. You know what? We have to stand firm. We have to let the Prime Minister negotiate a deal. And let's be clear, we need a good deal, not a quick deal. So we stand firmly behind the Prime Minister.
A move that would allow him to assert himself not just as a provincial leader, but as someone capable of standing up to Washington. When Ontario's anti-tariff ad aired, it became clear. Ford had decided to play the big game. The ad, which featured slogans about fair trade for fair Canadians, showed images of factory workers, flags, and even empty production halls, a hint that U.S. tariffs are hurting the real economy. The message was straightforward and simple. America is bringing us to our knees, but Ontario will rise and fight back. This tone resonated with public sentiment. People, tired of Ottawa's diplomatic language and cautious rhetoric, took Ford's words as a call to action. In the first few days after the ad aired, the Premier's approval rating in the province rose by 6 points, according to unofficial data, a figure that made even federal strategists nervous. However, behind this emotional outburst lay a calculated move. Behind the scenes at Queen's Park, it was said that the ad had been prepared in a hurry in just 5 days and agreed upon only by a small circle of advisors. Several officials close to the Federal Department of Trade claimed that they had not received any notification of the campaign's launch. Although such initiatives usually go through joint briefings, it looked like a challenge, not only to Washington, but to Ottawa itself.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Ford seemed to be deliberately testing how far he could go without crossing the line between provincial initiative and federal jurisdiction. And at first, it worked. The American media picked up on the story, with some commentators calling Ford the Canadian Trump, direct, straightforward, and unafraid of confrontation. In response, according to insiders, the White House was annoyed but decided not to react openly. It looked like a temporary misunderstanding until Trump unexpectedly broke off negotiations with Canada. That moment became a turning point. In Ottawa, everything changed literally overnight. The federal government, which had previously been carefully maneuvering between various provincial interests, suddenly took a tough stance. Prime Minister Mark Carney went to the press and stated that trade negotiations were exclusively a federal responsibility and that no provinces should interfere. His phrase, "It is the responsibility of the Government of Canada to conduct these negotiations," sounded not just like a statement, but like a warning. Translated into political language, it meant Ford step aside. Several provincial leaders immediately publicly supported Carney. According to internal information from CBC, the Ontario Premier's office received several calls that same evening from colleagues in other regions, with polite but cold hints that the time for provincial populism was over. These days, the atmosphere in the corridors of Parliament was tense. Harsh words were exchanged at committee meetings. One Ontario MP unofficially told reporters, "It seems Ottawa is afraid that Ford will hijack the agenda. He speaks louder than the feds, and they don't like that."
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Indeed, against the backdrop of the bureaucratic language of federal press releases, Ford's statements sounded like an explosion. His arguments about fair trade, Ontario's independence, and jobs that need to be brought back were perceived by many as a manifestation of national pride. Even opposition MPs in the province acknowledged that he had hit the nail on the head emotionally. But after Trump announced his withdrawal from the negotiations, the situation changed completely. Ottawa believed that the province's overly harsh rhetoric was one of the reasons for the escalation. According to unofficial reports, the day after Trump's statement, a closed-door conversation took place between Carney's office and Ford's administration. Sources say the dialogue was short and not particularly warm. The federal government demanded an end to public statements that could be perceived as interference in trade diplomacy. And then, for the first time, a new theme appeared in Ford's speech: cooperation. He said, "He is the Prime Minister, I am the Premier of the province. When it comes to national issues, I am here to support and offer ideas." To many observers, this sounded like an admission that the provincial front against tariffs was cracking at the seams. But to understand why Ford backed down, one must remember that for him, this campaign was not just a political move, but part of his image. He built his popularity on directness and displays of strength, and now he was forced to publicly soften his tone. It looked like a defeat. But in reality, according to several analysts, it was more of a pragmatic move. Internal polls showed that Ontarians supported the fight against tariffs, but did not want an escalation that could hurt the province's economy. Every day of downtime at the border, every canceled contract with American suppliers meant real losses for manufacturers. Ford may have realized that in order to maintain his influence, he needed to slow down at the right time.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Meanwhile, disagreements began within the province itself. Several ministers in his cabinet insisted that the advertising should continue and that it was important not to show weakness. Others, on the contrary, believed that a way should be found to synchronize communication with Ottawa so as not to give Trump a reason to use Canada's internal disagreements in the negotiations. In the end, Ford chose a compromise. The campaign was curtailed, but with the wording "mission accomplished." Behind the scenes, it was said that he managed to get out of the situation with minimal losses. He retained his reputation as a decisive politician, but formally complied with the federal course. And yet, a residue remained. A new line of division appeared in society between those who believed that Canada should present a united front and those who saw Ottawa's decisions as overly cautious. Forums, talk shows, and newspaper columns debated who was right: Ford, who defended independence, or Carney, who demanded centralized control. Even a week after the incident, the ratings of both leaders fluctuated. Ford was losing support in large cities, but gaining ground in small industrial areas. The anti-tariff campaign was not just an episode in trade disputes. It showed how fragile the Canadian Federation can be when economic pressure turns into a political storm. And although on the outside it looked like a routine adjustment of rhetoric, in reality it was a struggle for influence, for the right to speak on behalf of the country, for the trust of people tired of political compromises.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Ford realized that fighting Washington was not a television commercial or a slogan. It was a chess game where every word could be either a winning move or a trap. And while he initially acted like a player driven by emotions, after a sharp turn of events, he began to think like a strategist. His transition from challenging to supporting the federal course was not a defeat, but a step back before a new maneuver. Perhaps this maneuver is still ahead. After all, as they say in politics, those who know how to retreat at the right time stay in the game longer than anyone else. After the federal government's public statement about its exclusive jurisdiction in trade negotiations with the U.S., it became clear that the atmosphere between Ottawa and the provinces had changed. Whereas Ford had previously allowed himself to make loud statements about a free Canada that does not bow to foreign tariffs, he now spoke more cautiously, weighing every word. Behind the scenes at Queen's Park, it was said that after talking with Mark Carney, the Ontario Premier's tone changed literally overnight. According to one advisor, the speech prepared for his next public appearance was rewritten 3 times, first in a combative tone, then in a conciliatory tone, and finally in an emphatically diplomatic tone. Ford realized that if he continued to defy Ottawa, he would be isolated not only politically but also economically. Financial support for federal programs, subsidies for industry, infrastructure grants, all of this depended on relations with the center. This meant that he had to change his strategy without losing face. Ford's change of position was subtle, almost imperceptible. He did not offer a public apology or directly retract his words, but he began to talk more often about coordination, joint efforts, and national unity. When journalists asked him whether Ontario planned to continue acting independently, he replied, "We will work together with the federal government to achieve the best deal for Canadians."
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
This seemingly neutral statement was in fact symbolic of a political turnaround. Previously, he would have said, "for the people of Ontario," but now he said, "for Canadians." This transition was not accidental. His communications team understood that they needed to build an image not of a provincial rebel, but of a mature leader ready to support national interests. At the same time, Ottawa also understood that open conflict could not be allowed to happen. Despite Carney's harsh statements, the federal government did not want to turn Ford into a victim of pressure because they knew that the public was on the side of strong leaders who spoke simply and confidently. Therefore, reports began to appear in the press about a new unity between Ottawa and Ontario, although in reality it was more of a truce than an alliance. Internal sources claim that representatives of the Federal Department of Trade and Ford's advisors met behind closed doors, agreeing on key messages for the press to create the impression of a common line. In fact, Ford was given the role of a conditional partner of the federal government, someone who helps but does not command.
On November 4th, our government will table the first federal budget, our first federal budget. And that'll be our plan to protect our communities, our borders, our way of life. Our plan to build a stronger economy where everyone has a chance to get ahead. And our plan to empower Canadians with new opportunities, better careers, and a lower cost of living. Central to those missions.
However, there was a downside to this diplomatic balance. Doubts began to grow in the province. Some voters felt that the Premier had given up. Radio listeners calling into local talk shows said he used to be our voice, but now he's just repeating Ottawa's words. One union leader, speaking at a rally in Hamilton Sound, said that Ontario should not become a backdrop for federal politics. These sentiments worried Ford the most. He understood that concessions could be presented as a strategy, but only if they were followed by at least one decisive action proving that Ontario was still fighting. And that action was the alcohol measure, the decision to remove American alcohol from LCBO shelves. This initiative appeared symbolic, almost gestural, but over time it became the main instrument of political pressure. Formally, it did not have a huge economic effect. The share of American alcohol in provincial store sales did not exceed a few percent. However, the effect in the media space was stunning. Newspaper headlines wrote about Canada's response to trade aggression, and talk shows discussed whether buying bourbon had now become an act of betrayal. Hashtags such as #BuyCanadian and #NoBourbonWeek began to appear on social media. Ford deliberately fueled this wave without violating his fundamental agreement with the federal government. He said, "We stand with Ottawa, but we also stand with our workers. And if that means giving up American whiskey, we'll do it."
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Federal officials reacted to this move with caution. On the one hand, the measure seemed harmless. It did not violate trade agreements and had no direct impact on negotiations. On the other hand, Washington could perceive it as a provocation. One diplomat noted in an off-the-record comment that any action against American goods is taken by Trump as a personal insult. That is why Ottawa feared that the alcohol boycott would once again irritate the White House. However, Ford was not going to back down. For him, it was a way to maintain his reputation as a decisive leader without entering into open confrontation with the federal government. He even publicly emphasized, "We will not back down, but we will support the Prime Minister in the negotiations. Let him get a good deal, and we'll provide pressure from below." Over time, the boycott decision took on a life of its own. In some provinces, small retail chains voluntarily joined the initiative, while in others, they called it populism. Several American alcohol producers sent official letters to Canadian trade authorities expressing concern about discriminatory actions. Ford did not respond to these letters, limiting himself to the phrase, "If they want to get their product back on our shelves, let their president return to the negotiating table." This rhetoric helped him regain some of the support he had lost after his conciliatory statements. The opposition, however, took a dual position.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
Some of its representatives said that the alcohol measure did not solve the real problems, but acknowledged that it looked effective. One opposition MP even said in an interview, "If we can't influence the White House directly, then at least let American producers feel the pressure." Thus, a move that seemed purely symbolic became a political tool with which Ford could demonstrate his power without stepping outside the federal umbrella. Meanwhile, rumors were circulating in diplomatic circles that Ottawa was considering a quiet lifting of the boycott in exchange for concessions from the U.S. Options were discussed in which the ban would be replaced by a quota or temporary import restrictions to save face for both sides. However, Ford refused to support such an initiative, stating that Ontario does not trade its principles. Now, this refusal did not cause an open conflict, but it served as a reminder that despite his new moderation, Ford remained an independent player, ready to defend the interests of his province even when federal diplomacy preferred to remain silent. This whole story showed how thin the line is between political cooperation and the struggle for influence. It was important for the federal government to show unity, but for Ford, it was important not to dissolve into that unity. He managed to stay on this knife's edge, turning concession into the appearance of agreement and symbolic gesture into political power. His position changed, but it did not disappear. Now he spoke more quietly, but every word was calculated, every action thought out. Behind the outward calm lay a tense game in which the stakes remained the same: power, trust, and control over who really speaks for Canada. While the federal government tried to bring the negotiations with Washington back on track, the alcohol boycott initiated by Ontario became an unexpectedly long-lasting tool of pressure.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
In the first weeks after the ban was introduced, the reaction was mixed. Some saw it as an act of national pride, others as cheap populism. But as time passed, the consequences began to be felt. Several American alcohol producers reported a decline in exports and growing pressure from their lobbyists, demanding that the White House resolve the situation. And this meant that a move intended to be symbolic had indeed become a sticking point, albeit not a key one, in the negotiation process. Meanwhile, a debate raged within Canada over whether to maintain the ban. Some federal ministers privately acknowledged that it was complicating communications with their American counterparts. However, lifting the measure would mean publicly admitting defeat, and no one wanted that. Ford took advantage of this political vacuum. He declared that he was ready to return American goods to the shelves, but only if a fair deal was reached. These words sounded like a challenge, but in reality, they were aimed at domestic voters. There was a growing feeling in the province that the premier was standing up not so much to the U.S. as to his own toothless federal government. By the fall, public perception of the boycott had changed. Whereas it had previously been seen as a temporary measure, it had now become a symbol of perseverance.